Welcome to What Nobody Tells Us. I'm your host, Christy Bishop, and today's episode is something that has been a special request from several of you since I launched this podcast, and it is around the topic of living with grief. Now, grief is such a complex and layered and complicated experience, and it's such an uncomfortable topic for people to bring up. But the stark reality is that everyone grieves. And it doesn't have to be the grief of losing someone who's passed away. There are multitudes of types of grief. There are griefs around death and loss. There are griefs around the loss of a friendship, or if you break up with a friend. There is loss around the expectations for your life or your life not turning out the way that you wanted it to. There's grief around moving. There's grief around changing a job and expectations. There's so many different types of grief. But the thing that they all have in common is that people don't like to talk about them. Our culture, for better for worse, gives us permission to be happy, gives us permission to be excited, optimistic, joyous. But when it comes to really talking about the things that we're struggling with, i.e., grief and long term ongoing grief, again, no matter what level it is or how layered it is, it's just uncomfortable. We're expected to deal with whatever we're dealing with privately, maybe with a select group of friends who reach out and surround us immediately after something bad happens. But we're expected to process it quickly, move on quickly, and get back to life, just like everyone else who was there to show up for you in the early days gets back to their lives. Because again, our society just doesn't like to talk about grief. Well, my guest today is a grief educator, and there is no one better or more well versed to talk about the subject of grief. Her name is Suzanne Jabour, and Suzanne started on her journey to being a grief educator after the sudden loss of her son, who was in his early 20s, Ben, in the early days of the pandemic. Now, she tells her story there, but Suzanne leans into grief in every possible way. And the conversation that we have is it's honestly the most detailed conversation I've ever had with anyone around grief. And I think it's going to be incredibly helpful for people who are grieving in any capacity at all, whether it's new grief, it's long term ongoing grief, whether it's like light grief, whether it's the deepest, darkest grief. But again, the thing is, this is not a depressing, sad conversation. This is a conversation about hope, but it's also a reality check. Like, we literally get into how can you manage your body physically at the first stages of grief, and how do you get out of that panic attack? How do you actually remind yourself to breathe? All the way to how do you manage the waves of grief, whether they're expected or unexpected, when the majority of your day to day is going pretty well, but then you get knocked down by a wave. How do you manage that? And how do you keep going? We talk about the different types of grief. And for example, there's a grief called anticipatory grief, which is something that I have dealt with and I want to say suffered from and lived with for years. Anticipatory grief is when you are anticipating something bad happening to someone. And so, with my husband, Brian, who's been battling brain cancer for 14 years, I have had anticipatory grief where I'm actually grieving him while he's still alive. And that is a mind fuck. I'll tell you that, but we talk about that as well. We also get into the physical manifestations of grief, the emotional manifestations of grief. Um, we talk about what makes grief better. And most importantly, we talk about what friends and family can do and the types of support that people need, what you literally can say. We talked about a script and the types of friend that you need to be to show up for someone who is grieving and to get out of your own discomfort to actually show up and stay there, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you feel or how you literally don't know what to do. Another fascinating facet of the conversation is literally the topic of grief brain, which I know I have absolutely struggled with, but Suzanne gave me possibly one of the biggest aha moments I've ever had around talking about the fact that grief actually rewires your brain in certain capacities. And so we could really dive into that. And then a really interesting point is we move on from individual grief to collective grief and societal grief. Now, Lord knows we have all suffered immensely over the past several, my gosh, it's now 3.5 years from the pandemic. And not just losing millions of people, but the loss of identity, the loss of jobs, the loss of family members, the loss of expectations, loss of relationships. There's just been so much loss, but it hasn't been processed correctly. So we both talk about how that's manifesting itself now. Um, and then finally, we get into grief at work and how leaders and managers can identify the signs that someone on their team might be grieving and what they can do about it. And if you're a leader, what you can do to actually start to have these transparent, vulnerable conversations that not only build psychological safety amongst your team and amongst your organization, but it helps people feel comfortable in sharing their grief, connecting with others, and then you ultimately end up doing a much better job and having a team who's high performing and satisfied, and also personally able to work through their grief because they know they're supported on a professional level. So we dive into all of this. Again, my guest name is Suzanne Jabour. I really hope that you get so much out of this conversation. And again, it's such a wonderful thing to have you reach out to me and let me know what you want to hear about, because these conversations are meant to help you. I mean, they certainly help me. God knows they're cathartic, but they're meant to help you get through situations in your life that you're uncomfortable talking about. So, without further ado, please enjoy this episode. Do me a favor, don't forget to subscribe, rate the podcast, and review the podcast wherever you may listen to it. But I hope you love this one and take away some great lessons. And if you know someone who would benefit from this, by all means, please share, because we need to stop grieving in silence and actually talk about our experiences. Enjoy. Hi, Suzanne. Thank you so much for joining What Nobody Tells Us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. We're going to have a juicy conversation. I know that already.
We are. Yeah, it's very funny for listeners. We were just talking before we officially started taping. I was like, we're going to start taping because we have just had this whole conversation and now we need to actually capture it for real.
You
Um,
know,
Yeah, exactly. Suzanne is a grief educator, and the timing for this conversation could not be more perfect. As unfortunately, yesterday I just shared with Suzanne that we found out that my husband Brian's father passed away yesterday. So we are right in the brand new throngs of grief, even though we live in, I'd say, some day-to-day grief just because, and
mhm.
PTSD because of his brain cancer situation. So I could not be more thrilled to have this conversation with you. And for everyone listening, I promise we're not going to be wildly depressing, but I think there's grief in every possible situation out there. And we're going to help people figure out how to get through it, what they can do, how friends and family can support, and also, like, there's no correct way to grieve. So we'll get into that too.
Yeah, and I just want to say I think it's so important that you frame it that way for people in the first, 15 seconds. This is not going to be a dark conversation. It's not going to be a sad conversation, even though what we're talking about has some of that to it. And it's also, as you say, just a part of life. Like
Yeah.
every change that we experience comes with some grief, even if it's a change for the better. And yes, then there's the big losses like you're experiencing with your father in law. And I'm so sorry to hear that. I'm so sorry. This is such a timely conversation. And it sucks. And, it is as bad as you think and as confusing and all the things that you're experiencing. And the quicker we can get to a place where we can all talk about that and not feel scared that it's going to be dark and sad and heavy, the sooner we can change this isolation we all feel and the fear that we all feel and this whole weird construct we find ourselves in where we're just not talking about it. And it's so unhealthy for all of us, for the grievers, the supporters, the bosses, supervisors, grocery store clerk. It's just bad for all of us. So we're going to break some of that down today.
It's like the book Everybody Poops that we share. It's like everybody grieves. Everybody grieves.
It's true. We might not
Yes.
admit that even to ourselves, but we do.
Yes, that's true. All right. Well, if you don't mind, can you share your story? You went through a very, very traumatic experience in 2020. So I want to be really sensitive talking about it, but it led you to become a grief educator, which, that was clearly part of your journey. But if you don't mind sharing your experience, that would be wonderful.
Of course. So I come to this work after my most recent loss, which, as you say, was traumatic and in 2020. My son Ben died in September of that year, and it was as horrifying and disorienting and identity shifting and just devastating as you would expect it to be. I lived every parent's worst nightmare, got that middle of the night phone call. And, that was the end of that version of my life and the beginning of what I needed to reconstruct from there. And I became a grief educator partly because I became so curious about grief. And I knew from the very early days that survival for me was going to be about being conscious and curious. So the conscious piece was about being conscious of all the emotions. We're so great as North Americans at being unconscious of our emotions. We love to shut them down and ignore them and pretend they're not a thing unless they're things like happy and gratitude and joyful and all that stuff, which of course when you're in grief, you don't get any of the ones from that side of the list. You just get all the other ones. And I knew I had grieved enough times. My dad died when I was in my 30s and my mom when I was in my 40s. So this wasn't my first close loss of someone who was an intrinsic part of my life. It's very different when it's a child. It's, grief on a different level for me. And I think for most parents who've lost a child find it that way. And I also knew that any stuffing I would blow up. That it's usually happens in cartoons or in really campy movies where the opera singer sings that one note and the glass shatters to bits. And I
Mhm.
knew for me, if I didn't allow all of it, even when it was overwhelming and I just had to curl up in a ball and sob, I was that fragile. I was that glass that
Yep.
was going to burst into a million pieces. So that was the conscious part. It sounds really, brave, and I don't even know what it sounds like. For me, it was a matter of survival. And the
Yeah.
curiosity was about what now? Like, my life doesn't exist anymore the way that I knew it, the way I had envisioned it moving forwards. I don't exist anymore. The person who went to bed the night before that phone call, she doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So, who am I? What is my life about? Like, it really broke me down to that level where I was just in pieces and had to
Yes.
figure out how to put myself back together, how to put a life back together. And I lived with a lot of curiosity about survival. First of all, if you're someone who's in those early days of a catastrophic loss and, all you can do is curl up on the couch and sob, I see you. I've been there. At that stage, the curiosity was about, like, how do I breathe? How do I just calm my body enough that I can oxygenate myself? Because I know this is important, right? And when you're in that full on ugly cry and you're just gasping for those short breaths, I thought, I can't live like that. Like, how do I like slow this down? How do I just
Yes.
breathe? And then as you move out of survival mode, my curiosity became about, why were some people able to show up and some people weren't? Why
Mm-hmm.
do we as a collective have so much phobia around grief? Why do we not know what to say? Why do we like so much curiosity? And then I knew I wanted an educational underpinning to my work going forward because I knew I was going to do something to do with grief. And so I did a grief educator course with David Kessler, who's a very well known grief expert. He's written 6 books, I think, about grief.
Hmm.
And I wanted to do his course because I wanted to understand how universal or not my experience was,
Mm.
and how universal or not, what I had learned and begun to understand about how grief worked and showed up and operationalized. Like, how much of that was just me, and was I an outlier, or was this, a version of our universal experience? And I think,
Yeah.
what I learned was that yes, it was a version of our universal experience, which, we're all going to experience grief. We all experience grief on the regular. And every time we do, and every loss we experience is different. For us, like losing my dad was different than losing my mom, was different than losing my child. And so it's different for me those 3 times. And any other person who lost a dad and then a mom and then a child would have a different experience. So it's this universal thing that can connect us but ends up isolating us. And I think it's because we lack the education.
Yes. Oh my God. There's so much to unpack there. I don't even know where to go, but I think where I'll go is naturally where you talk about literally the moment to moment, the breath to breath that you're talking
Yeah.
about, because you call it the ugly cry. I actually call it the silent cry, because you're crying
Yeah.
so hard, you're not making any noise and you actually can't breathe. And I had that moment about 3.5 weeks ago where I literally had to physically try to stop myself so I could literally take a breath. So for
Yeah.
when someone's in that situation and they're in that physiological, like, it's not even fight or flight response, it's just honestly
No.
trauma and terror,
Yep.
how did you stop? Like, let's start to dive into those tiny, like, minute moments. How did you start to calm yourself down? Because you can't, like, to be physiologically curious makes perfect sense, but when you're just in absolute devastation, how
Yep.
did you start to slow things down for yourself?
So it was so interesting to me that because I was holding that curiosity piece, I had
Mm,
in my toolbox and somewhere like in my memory these weird random skills that I pulled out. And I had literally heard a podcast about, I don't know, 2 weeks maybe. I'll have to look up when it was released. Maybe 2 weeks or so ish before Ben died.
mhm.
And it was Brene Brown, who I think is brilliant. If you haven't encountered her, she's everywhere and she's fabulous and you need to listen to everything she says.
Of
She
course.
had on these two brilliant sisters whose names I can never remember, who wrote a fabulous book, which I've read multiple times, called Burnout. And
Mhm.
they had actually talked on the podcast about that exact situation where you're in the ugly cry,
Yep.
and what their whole book is about, completing the stress cycle, right? So
Mhm.
part of what happens when we get burnout is because we're not completing the stress cycle. So you can't release it if you don't complete the cycle. So this was all in my memory bank somewhere, which are incredibly hard to access when you're in early grief. But for whatever reason, I remembered this one thing they had talked about. And what they said to do when you're in that ugly cry is you shift your thinking from the path you're on. So I'm in, oh my gosh, Ben has died. I don't even know who I am.
Mhm.
I don't understand how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. I can't feed
Yep.
myself or do anything I'm supposed to be able to do. And you're on that path of, my future looks different. He's not going to be here. What about my daughter? What about our family? Like, you're on that path. So you're in on that rabbit hole, right? So when you
Mhm.
break your thoughts away from those to what's happening with your body.
Mhm.
So you
Mhm.
shift your attention to, oh my gosh, my face is all squinched up and my shoulders are so high they're like earrings. And my
Mhm.
chest feels so tight I can't even get a breath. And my arms are shaking. And just the shift in that thought process to what's happening physically releases the train you were on, which is not a train to anything helpful,
Right.
and shifts you to really connecting with what's going on in your body, which slows it down, completes
Mhm.
the stress cycle, which was critical for me because I was also very clear that this trauma was not going to become malignant in my body. And I was going to do whatever it took for that to not happen. Right. So I thought, okay, I need to be very aware of like this stress cycle. Oh, there is this way to do it. And I remember saying to one of Ben's best friends who phoned me to say, like, I can't stop crying and I don't know what to do. And I said, okay, I have this super weird exercise for you to try, but just like
Yeah.
try it and see if it works. Because for me, it really was magical because you have to shift your thinking away from that path to the pit and shift it to what's happening in my body. Bill Cosby, way back in the day, because I'm young enough to have had records of his stand up, did a hilarious stand up routine about the glazed donut monster, which is a little kid with
Mhm.
a cold, right? So you know how that,
Oh.
right?
Yeah.
A little kid with a cold. So my thoughts would go to, oh my gosh, I'm literally the glazed donut monster. Like, there's snot all over my face. There's
Yes.
tears. It's all gross. And like, I'm hyperventilating and my arms hurt and I feel like I'm going to throw up. Like,
Yes.
and when I could get in touch with all of that, then it would slow it down. And then I could start to breathe again. So
Mhm.
that really was something I did, I mean, for months when that
I'm
wave would
sure.
come. I would go, okay, I know what to do with this. I don't need to have those thoughts, which are not real, are not anything. Like, they're not
Yeah.
helpful. And I knew very clearly there was nothing helpful for me on that train of thought. So I needed to learn how to shift from that as
Yeah.
efficiently as possible.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, yeah, it's survival, like you said. It's literally
Yeah.
the few first days, weeks, months of survival. And as
Yeah.
much as people might want to just stop time, like this is a silly example, but it wasn't at the time for me. I remember when my first dog died and I was living in Arizona at the time.
Mm.
He had moved with me from Dallas to Arizona, and he passed away while I was on a business trip, and he had like a little heart
Oh,
attack. The poor guy was like inbred. It was just terrible. I got him from a puppy mill and I had no idea what a puppy mill was at the time. I was like 20 years old, 21 years old. And he literally just died. And it was the most traumatic thing ever. I flew back home and I remember waking up the next morning and I couldn't understand why the sun had actually come up. I
yeah.
genuinely was like, wait a minute. Like the world, like my life has stopped. And I know people out there like, it's just a dog, whatever. In my life, he was my little ride or die.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yep.
couldn't understand how the sun had come up, how the world was still turning, how the birds were still chirping, like everything needed to stop because I had stopped. And to me
Yeah.
it was a very visceral moment, but as much we want to like stay in that moment, and we'll talk about the malignancy and making sure the toxicity doesn't stay in your body and take over your life. People don't have the luxury of just staying and stopping. There's work, there's family, there's responsibilities, there's bills to pay. So what was your approach to continuing on as devastated as you were and barely functioning in things like work and with your daughter?
Yeah. So I was very clear this was all going to be about baby steps because there was
Okay.
no striding, right? I wasn't going to evil Knievel it across
Sure.
the Grand Canyon. I couldn't even walk. So this was going to be about like baby steps. And I
Hmm.
said that to someone the other day, and they pointed out really how brave baby steps are, which I so appreciated. Like, if you think about a little baby who's learning to walk, those baby
Hmm.
steps are actually really brave. Like, they're
Yeah.
scary and they're tentative and they're kind of a little bit wobbly, but that's really brave, right? So I knew it was going to be about baby steps. My daughter at the time was 25, so there's no, small
Mm.
children involved. And in our extended family, there aren't really small children either. So I was very clear that I could take care of myself and her. And I remember saying to her, like, I'm going to be very clear with you. I'm going to take care of myself first. And then I'm absolutely here to help take care of you and for anything that you need. And everybody else is on their own. Like, I
Yeah.
had to just let it be okay that that was not going to be part of my role anymore.
Hmm.
I couldn't be
Yeah.
everything to everybody. I had to be what I needed and what she needed. So that
Yes.
became very clear. And I think that that's really important. Unfortunately, right now, society doesn't really give us permission to take really great care of ourselves, especially
Yes.
when we're grieving, right? Society wants us to be as quiet as possible, get over it as quickly as possible, and mostly
Yes.
not talk about it. That's not healthy for any of us. So we're going to break that down. And I knew that was, again, this is about survival. I had to be selfish for my own survival, and I had to take care of her because she lost her brother. She's 25. She lives with me. I'm going to help be responsible for her. Everyone
Yeah.
else, you're grown ups, you're on your own.
Yeah.
That was part of it. I was really fortunate in my work situation, just timing wise, that I had about 2 weeks where I didn't have a lot of demands at work.
Hmm.
So, and 2 weeks is not long enough, but it gave me the space to be able to at least have those 2 weeks where I could do the bare minimum that was had to be done to keep everything moving and ignore the rest. And then I was really fortunate in that the team that I worked with, I mean, they totally got it and expected that I would be not a lot of use to anybody. So I kept some tasks that were critical that I did. A lot of other tasks got given to other people and they very graciously took them. I was in a situation where I needed to grieve out loud. And I know that's not the reality for everyone. For me,
Yeah.
that was the path to survival. And so I also was really fortunate in that through a whole weird circumstance, which is a longer story than I need to tell, one of the women at the office ended up sending an email to everybody involved in our production.
Yes. Yes. So
Like,
helpful.
I worked on a TV show, everybody in Vancouver, everybody in LA, like everybody. So I knew everybody I encountered already knew. So one of the things that happened was one of Ben's friends launched a GoFundMe to do a
Hmm.
donation to a mental health charity in his
Yeah.
name. And so in the days pre-COVID, I would have been working in the office. I would have put something up on the bulletin board and, people would have
Yeah.
donated as you do, right?
Right.
I was at that stage working from home and our offices
Hmm.
had been kind of dismantled. A bunch of us had been sent home. And I
Right.
said to her, like, I would normally just put this up on the bulletin board, but I can't do that. So could you do
Hmm.
that for me? Or could you just do like whatever you think is the equivalent of that? And she took
Yeah.
it upon herself to share that GoFundMe with everybody in the organization,
Oh my God.
which
Incredible.
ended up being a huge gift because the telling, still almost 3 years later, the
Hmm.
telling is
Yeah.
the worst. It's like a
Yes.
knife to the heart every time you have to say it. So to
Yes.
know that everybody knew was huge. So that gave me permission. And, we have this weird kind of stratification of losses that we think are like worthy of grief, which I think is ridiculous because every loss is worthy of grief
Hmm.
for whatever reason. And I think there's all kinds of good reasons, but the loss of a child tends to be up that list. So
Yes.
that gave me a lot of grace from people and a lot of permission that I
Mm.
like the expectation was that I would be grieving. So
Right.
different than you experienced with the loss of your dog, even though in many ways that's just as important in your life when that's like the person you live with, it's the creature you live with that moved with you from another place that goes home. I'm sorry. Like there is no better greeting than that of the dog who loves you when you open the door, when you come home from
Right.
work, right? That is
Yes.
a big loss for people, but it's way down the list that we kind of go, oh, it's just a pet. Like, and never mind if you want to express grief about the loss of a job or the loss of an opportunity or the loss of a friendship or the loss of I mean, in the last 3 years, we've all lost all kinds of everything. And we all have a whole lot of grief. Like, I'm still mad that I lost my vacation. And I know I'm not the only one, right? But there's all kinds of things like that we're just not giving ourselves permission to talk about. And all of that suppressed emotion, I think, is what we're seeing lashing out right now. We're seeing so much fear lashing out. And I think it's all of that stuffed emotion that we're not talking about from the last 3 years of chaos.
Oh, without a doubt. Did you, and we'll get into that for sure. When you were grieving in the early days, it's like, thank goodness you had that support system at work who
Mm-hmm.
understood, because a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
don't. And
Yep.
thank goodness you had the coworker slash, I would say, fortuitous friend to send out news. To the telling is so
Yeah.
important. That was one of the things that I found so helpful, but also just like the biggest literal weight off of my back when Brian was diagnosed early days and given like 6 months to live. To have that conversation again and again and again and again, there is literally nothing worse, and it's impossible to do physically, spiritually, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing, I actually had a friend who offered to send out a note to everyone, and I was like, just here the bare minimum details. I would could barely function, had no idea what I was even saying. I was like, just say this and do, and she took
Yeah.
care of it. And it was like, thank God. So then the onslaught of support came, right? And I'm sure you had the
Mm.
onslaught of support too in the early days, as it always happened. Did you experience after that, I'll use air quotes, the appropriate amount of time to grieve
Yeah.
passed by? Did you find that that support system waned a bit as other people went back to their lives, and then you were left with the quiet? Because that was one of the most difficult things for me, even though I've not lost Brian. Like Brian is still here,
Mm-hmm.
but there's living grief versus
Yeah.
loss of grief of loss.
Yeah.
So how did you experience that, and if so, how did you live through that?
Yeah. I think that's 100% normal.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I don't think it should be normal, but that at this moment in time, it seems to be the norm. For most people, the rhythm kind of is once you've gotten to the funeral, memorial, celebration of life, whatever it is, whatever the ritual event is going to be,
Mhm.
support disappears.
Yeah, sure.
That seems to be about the timing. So that's maybe a few days, maybe a week. I will tell you that people need support for much, much, much longer than that. I
Yes.
didn't do my own grocery shopping for about a year and a half because I just couldn't. The grocery store is so fraught for grievers. It's such a challenging place to be for all kinds of reasons. And I just couldn't manage it. I just couldn't do it. So luckily, I had one person who was like, I love grocery shopping. I'm like, great. Here's the
Take it and
list.
run. Yeah.
Take it. I don't want to ever do it again. And now, of course, I can. But it took, like, it was a year and a half when I sat and thought about, wait a minute, I'm actually doing my whole grocery shopping list, which I could do like 4 or 5 things at a time.
Yeah,
And that
yeah.
was like what I could manage. So yes, that sort of, and it's almost overwhelming. Like when people ask me, I get people contact me all the time who say, oh my gosh, like my friend just had a loss and I don't know what to do. And I'll say to
Yes.
them, is this like a really good friend or is this like an acquaintance friend?
Right.
If it's a really good friend, my advice actually is to reach out to them and say, I know you're overwhelmed with support right now. I'm going to reach out to you again in 3 weeks.
Yes.
Because they
Yes.
don't actually
Amen.
need you right now. Your
They
really close
don't.
friends, they don't need you yet. They need
Yes.
you 2 weeks from now when all the acquaintance friends have disappeared back into their lives.
Oh,
That's
Suzanne. Yes.
when we need
Yes.
you.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So like if you can't make it to the funeral, but you could go a month later for 2 weeks, do that. They don't need
Yes.
you at the funeral. There's tons of people there. Tell them
Yes.
why you're not there. Apologize. Say, I would love to be with you on that day. I know you will be surrounded by support on that day. I'm going to come 2 weeks later when I can actually take a chunk of time and we can really sit together.
Yes.
That's
Absolutely.
when
Yes.
we need you. And I was really fortunate, I realize now, even though it felt like everyone had scattered to the wind, which is also really hurtful and really hard on the griever. That's one of those secondary losses, is when like your people disappear and all the people you thought were your ride or dies are gone. I
Yeah.
had about 3 that stayed and showed up whether I wanted them to or not.
Yes. That's so
And,
important. Yes.
dragged me out of the house. I had one friend, bless her heart, we still go for a walk every week. And she just would come and say, I'm taking you for a walk. Like, you have got to get out of your apartment. You
That
can't,
is
like,
incredible.
even if we go for 5 minutes, like, I'm taking you out of the house. I had another friend who would regularly phone. I had a friend who messaged me a text message every month on the month anniversary. So the 26th of every month, she would message me. These are simple things that we can do to support each
Yes.
other long term, right?
Yes.
If you put a message in your calendar, like we all have these magical calendars in our phone computers now. I have repeating events for a number of people who've passed. So I know when that day is, because if I get a text on Ben's anniversary from someone who also remembers that's what the day is,
Yeah.
that's a huge gift to me because I will never forget. And I think we get tangled up in worry that we're like going to remind the person and we don't want to make them sad.
Oh God, no.
So
It's the
I'm
opposite.
here to tell you, you will not remind them. They remember. I know every second of every day that Ben has died.
Mhm.
The fact that you also remember
Mhm.
is a gift to me,
Yes.
right? That means his life had impact outside of just our family.
Absolutely.
That
And that
means
he's
other
not
people are
lost.
reminded of him, right? And then he's not lost. And so, like, I love getting those kind of messages. Oh, I thought of Ben today because I saw this person that reminded me of him, or I saw this ridiculous thing, or I heard a song, or whatever it is. I love getting those kind of messages. I have not forgotten. And if you're worried about making me cry, I cry all the time anyway. So,
Right. Right.
like, so don't
Exactly.
worry about it. Like, sometimes
Yeah.
our emotions come out of our eyes as liquid, and that's actually healthy. They're supposed to come out of our body. We're not supposed to just stuff them all down. So, if something you say makes me feel emotional and those emotions well up into tears, I'm okay with that. I see that as being really healthy.
Hmm.
So we don't have
Absolutely.
to feel fear about those things. And equally, if the person you're supporting says, I would rather never talk about this again, you get to honor that too. But that's very, very, very rare
I've actually never heard
because
that before. Yeah.
no, but if you do, you have to
Yeah.
honor that too, right? But for most of us, it's a huge gift. It's a
Yeah. You
huge
said,
gift.
or to me early on when we first met, you were like, you said something so poignant, and I had never been able to articulate it this way. You're like, grief and a loss like you suffered, or even I've again not suffered a loss, but grief in so many different ways with Brian, it changes your address book, completely
Yep.
rewrites it. 100%. And one of the things that I've had to explain to people is like some of the people that you think immediately are going to show up no problem completely check out, and
Yep.
that is so devastating. It's like grief on top of grief. So like you said, it's a secondary loss. But then there are those friends who do check in every 3 weeks, check in once a month, check in or whatever, drop off food. Like when Brian was really, really ill during the pandemic. I mean, he was near death. We almost lost him in December of 2020, I believe also 2021. We had daycare friends who we hadn't known that long. We weren't that close, dropping off food. They're like, this is what we're doing. This is it. And they put together a
Yep.
whole meal train. I could barely function myself, working a gazillion hours. Tessa's 3 years old and she needs to be homeschooled and learn her letters and her numbers. And Brian literally is completely out of it, down to 130 pounds, can't move around,
Uh,
can't eat, can't do anything. I like literally diarrhea all the time. Like, excuse me, TMI, but this is, a real,
it's
real
reality.
conversation. It's reality. And it was like those people who stayed, it cannot be overstated what you said earlier. It's like everyone flocks early days. Everyone
Yep.
flocks. The minute that like the ceremonial portion of this is done, whether it's oh diagnosed and then we're going back to life, oh funeral, going back to life, kind of like having a wedding, going back to life,
Yep.
cool, the ceremony's done, you need to show up after that, like, and continue to show up. Like, I think I mentioned to you before that we have a really, really close friend who lost a baby like 2 weeks before
Mm-hmm.
she was meant to be born. And it's on July 6th. And every July 6th, I text our really good friend and I'm like, I'm thinking of you. I'm thinking of baby's name. And I want to just honor her and honor you. And I talk about her to her.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not afraid to. And she's expressed, thank you so much for making this real because she was real to me. And other people are too terrified to bring her up. So bring up the loved one. Like, don't forget. And it's not scary for us to do that.
Yeah. And I think what's so important to remember is that it is that long term thing. And that's one of the things that I got really curious about because I was reading that everywhere. Grief changes your address book. Grief changes your address book. And I was like, but why? Like, what? Because it absolutely happened to me. As you say, the people you think have the capacity, have the emotional intelligence, are so compassionate. Like, of course, they would be the ones that would show up. For me, lots of those people disappeared. And I was like, well, what? I don't understand. Like, I thought
Mhm.
that's the relationship that we had. I thought that's who you were. Then you're, oh my gosh, you can go down so many rabbit holes with all of that because you're thinking,
I
well, maybe
know.
I was wrong. Maybe you weren't really that close of a friend. I don't know. You can spend a whole bunch of emotional energy there unnecessarily. It's grief. We're all terrified. That's
Mhm.
okay.
Mhm.
And the people who show up, I have a connection with them that will never diminish
Yes,
because I
absolutely.
know how hard it was for them because a lot of them told me. And I think that's really important too, that we give ourselves permission as the supporters to just be honest about how inept we feel if we do, how uncomfortable we feel if we are, how much we feel like we don't know what to do or say, but we're going to show up anyway. Like I had, these 3 or 4 friends who continued to show up and who continue to almost 3 years later. A number of them said, like, I don't know what to do. I don't even know how to
Mhm.
talk about this. I don't know
Yes.
what you need. I don't know what anybody needs, but like, I'm just going to keep showing up and we'll figure it out together. Cause
Mhm.
I didn't know either.
Yeah.
So I wasn't going to really be able to lead either and say, oh, this is exactly what I need because the brain fog is real.
Oh, the brain fog is. Can
Like,
you talk a little bit about that, the physiological symptoms of grief? Because some people don't understand that, like, you become a scrambled egg in your brain, and that can last a long time.
yeah. So, yes, brain fog is real. It's so disorienting.
Mhm.
For me, it was almost like you're having these layers of losses, right? So Ben has died. I've also lost myself. I don't know what to do with my life. I evidently don't remember how to breathe properly. Like all these things are happening. And evidently I also have like instant onset dementia because I don't remember how to
Yes.
shower. I don't know how to I don't understand how time works. I can't remember a thing. My daughter tells a hilarious story of the first time we thought we would be able to feed ourselves and we decided we would make a grilled cheese sandwich. It took us 45 minutes to make a grilled cheese sandwich. Now, if you think about it, there's actually a lot of steps that are unconscious to most of us to making a grilled cheese sandwich.
Mhm.
When all of that unconscious muscle memory has disappeared,
Mhm.
it's really complicated to make a grilled cheese sandwich. There's a lot of steps. There's a lot of ingredients you have to gather. Like you have to find the bread and the mayonnaise and the cheese. And I'm vegan, so we had to find 2 kinds of cheese and then 2 kinds of mayo, 2 kinds of
Mhm.
butter, two
Mhm.
frying pans. This is actually really complicated. Took us 45 minutes. We didn't cook again for months after that because we were like,
I
evidently we don't
believe
know how
it.
to do
I
that.
believe it. Yeah.
Like you're standing in the shower, and I have long said I think we have our best thoughts in the shower because everything we're doing is unconscious, right?
Yes.
Nobody as an adult has to stand in the shower and think, I'm going to shampoo my hair and then I'm going to rinse it out. And this is how I do that. And then I'm going to shampoo again and then I'm going to condition and then I'm going to wash my arms. We don't have to think about any of that. We have a routine. It happens automatically. That's why we have great creative thoughts in the shower. I
Yes.
would stand in the shower and go, I'm in the shower. Okay. Have I washed my hair? I don't actually know that. So let's try it again. Let's just do it again, just in case. And then it would be like so squeaky and dried because I'd already
Yes.
shampooed twice and I'm shampooing a third time. I'm like,
Yes.
well, evidently we were ready for conditioner, right? All of that whole sense of like automated things gone. Being able
Yes.
to find, like, I've lived in the city I live in since I was 8. I'm
Mhm.
now almost 56. I've lived here for a really long time.
Mhm.
I've never used my GPS to get to places I've known my entire life more
Yeah.
because I could
Yes.
not remember, like, I'm going to go here and then 3 blocks later I'm going to turn on that street, which the name of which completely escapes me now. Like, I couldn't keep track of tasks. So
Mhm. Mhm.
multi-step things. And this is something you can really watch for in employees. This is a tip that I give to business leaders, right? If you have an employee that used to be really great at multi-step tasks, so you could
Mhm.
say, oh, go and do A and then B and then C and then come back to me and report out what D is. And they come back to you after A because they've forgotten what to do next. Or they
Yes.
started at D and they come back to you and the task is only partway done.
Mhm.
It might be worth investigating if there's some grief going on.
Yes.
Because for
Yes.
me, that whole sense of I could hold in my head all of those steps and do them in the right order, impossible. That's why cooking was so hard.
Mhm.
Like the thought of like finding the recipe, buying the ingredients,
Yes.
doing everything in the right order, that's too hard. It was too much for me. I couldn't do it.
I completely understand.
Remembering, like, so that's the brain fog piece. And then there's all kinds of other physical things that are happening. So your digestive system for a lot of people goes all completely
Mhm.
haywire, sleep goes haywire, your
Yes.
energy levels plummet, like all
Yes.
kinds of physiological things happen. A lot of people experience tingling, like I think that's circulatory, right? Tingling in their extremities.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
suspect to do with circulatory issues because your whole body is in fight or flight or freeze or panic or some level of those things. Um, and a lot of it, I think, happens for kind of all kinds of good reasons, if that makes sense. Because I actually think our body is a really brilliant instrument, and so the brain fog partly also protects you because when everything's a little bit foggy. In those early days where you're just in survival, especially, the reality of your situation is so terrible.
Mhm.
And the cognitive dissonance is so loud because you're trying to make sense of the nonsensical. It's the same
Yes.
with the kind of diagnosis that you had with your husband.
Yeah.
You're trying to make sense of the nonsensical. So your brain is actually really busy trying to do that for you. And when I started to learn more about, the actual studies, there's a brilliant neurologist in the States who's doing all kinds of research on the brain and grief and what actually happens in the brain. And it's
Oh,
actually rewiring itself
really?
because all of those thoughts of, oh well, I have to remember to tell Ben that, or I should go see if Ben's awake yet, or I wonder what
Oh,
Ben wants for dinner, those automatic thoughts are all still firing, and then they
yes.
hit up against the knowledge that Ben is not here anymore. And
Oh my
that's that kind
God.
of, how you have that kind of,
Yes.
that's that fritz, right? Because your automatic thoughts are bumping up against the new reality. So your
Yes.
brain is actually having to rewire those neurological pathways. So no wonder our brains are foggy, right? They're actually rewiring themselves because the way that they operated doesn't work anymore.
I have literally, like, this is the world's biggest aha moment for me because I'm going back to when he was first diagnosed. And it was like,
Yeah.
and again, not like, oh, Brian's not here, but he's might as well have not been here when he started going
Mm-hmm.
through chemotherapy and radiation, and his brain basically exploded in his head from the chemo or from the radiation effects. And it was like he couldn't so like little things like, oh, Brian will put the dishes away. Brian will, we didn't have a child at the time, but like we had a dog. Like, oh, Brian will take the dog out. Brian will get the mail. Brian, it's like the responsibilities that we had divvied up because we always love to say like we're 50-50 partners. It's like our stupid little romantic saying that we say. It's very practical, but wonderful. But like we
Yeah.
pride ourselves on being that. It was like literally my brain had to rewire. And it's interesting. I have worked with several therapists and I to varying degrees of helpfulness. And right now I don't have one because I'm also like, no one can tell me he's going to be okay. Like that's just
Mm-hmm.
it. But I've also had to, I now do everything like all the time. And so I'm trying to like unwire or rewire,
Yeah.
like when he starts to get better, it's like the world's biggest roller coaster, because like I
Mm-hmm.
will go and do everything, and then he'll, when he's very ill, and then when he's not and he starts to kind of come back online, I'll have to like pull back, but I'm so used to doing everything that like that's a very difficult thing to do. So I'm in a constant state of unwire, rewire, unwire, rewire. It's, I've never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Oh my God. This
Right?
is
Your brain
crazy.
is really busy. No wonder it's going, yeah, I don't
Yes.
know how to make a grilled cheese sandwich. I'm busy.
Yeah. Yes. Literally, like, why hasn't the dishwasher been like, unloaded for 3 days? Like,
Yeah.
oh, somebody was supposed to do that. Shit, I guess it's me. Like, just,
Right?
yes. Oh
Yeah,
my
but
God.
and that just helped me so much to understand that it,
Yes.
first of all, it wasn't just me, and I already knew that,
Right.
but to understand that there's a physical reason this is happening. This isn't
Yeah.
just me being whatever stories we're telling ourselves about how we're supposed to be strong or independent or resilient or whatever. All the am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes. Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. Go for
All the bullshit we tell ourselves, that's not even
it.
a
Yes.
bad swear, but all that bullshit we tell ourselves,
Yes.
it's not that. It's actually that my brain is busy
Yeah.
fixing itself
Makes
because
perfect sense.
yeah, as you say, like nobody was going to unload the dishwasher or clean the
Right.
bathroom because
Right.
that person is actually not here anymore or that person is not capable anymore.
Right, but it's also a trigger, like the trash hasn't been taken out, and then it reminds you of the person who used to take out the trash, whether they're no longer there or they're sitting desperately ill, like suffering and dying from cancer. That,
Yeah.
like, I've had hysterical cries on the floor of the kitchen because something has just, like, so inane and innocuous triggered me like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that goes to another question I have around like long-term management. I've heard the quote, and I don't know if this is true because it's not true for me in the way that like I haven't again lost someone like that, where they say,
Mhm.
the grief doesn't ever get smaller. You just learn to grow bigger around it. And you're able, so
Mhm.
is there a way you can describe like the long-term maintenance of grief? Like what happens as you start to kind of move on? Because I don't think it ever goes away.
Yeah, it doesn't. And in a weird way, I don't really want it to. Like, I don't want to be in the early days where I couldn't make a grilled cheese sandwich or have a shower and I could
Right.
only lay on the couch and cry. I'm not saying I want to be there, but
Right.
I'm gonna move forward with. So I'm not
Yeah.
moving on. I'm not leaving behind. I'm not like there's none of
Mhm.
that. The same way I think of my dad regularly and I think of my mom regularly.
Mhm.
Ben will be critical part of my life forever. I will think of him
Yeah.
often. I think of him every day
Of
and
course.
talk to him often. So it is that sense of the goal being integration.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
it's not that we're going to move on or leave our person behind. And I think that that's part of the problem with the sort of subtext of some of the messaging we get as a collective is, right? You need to
Yeah.
move on. You need to get over it. You need to, whatever it is. Well, none of it, we don't actually want to do that because that all
Mhm.
implies that we're leaving our person behind. And we don't want to leave
Exactly
them
right.
behind, right? No man left behind. So for me, the goal is integration. And what that means is, and I do kind of love that analogy. There's some really great visuals around it where the grief is like a ball. And at first, the
Yes.
jar barely holds the ball. And then the jar gets bigger and bigger, which are really beautiful. I love water analogies too. So for me,
Mhm.
I love the water analogies. And I feel like now, I've kind of gone from in the early days, you're like in a tsunami, in a
Mhm.
whirlpool, and you are like flotsam and jetsam, right? You're just like a
Mhm.
piece of driftwood that's getting thrown around.
Yeah.
Then I realized I was a cork. So at least I knew I was buoyant. And every once in a while, I would bob to the surface, gasp a breath of air, right? Feel
Oh,
normal life. And then back underneath
yes.
I would go. But I'm a
I
cork,
love
so it's
that.
okay because I know I will get to the top for periods of time.
Yes.
And then I kind of felt like I was a rowboat. Okay. And you
Okay.
need to understand I am not a rowboat person. I cannot row a boat to save my life. If we need to go nowhere in particular, mostly in circles, I'm your gal. But otherwise, not a competent rower at all. So I'm now kind of in a rowboat. I don't know how to row, but at least I'm mostly on top of the water. So there's still big
Mhm.
waves that come and overwhelm the boat. That's
Yeah.
okay. But most of the time, like I'm above the water.
Mhm.
Then I'm kind of like in an actual boat with a steering wheel because I can steer. So this is fine.
Oh, I
So then you're a
love
little
this.
bit more in control, right? You have a little bit more
Yes.
control. Really big waves, you still can't manage those, but that's
Yeah.
okay. The storm is passing. The waves are a little further apart. Some of them are predictable, right? I
Mhm.
know for me, a week and a half from now is my birthday. A month exactly after that is Ben's anniversary. I know I'm in
Yeah.
for a hard row, and that's okay.
Yes.
I can see that wave coming. I don't yet
Yes.
know what the consequences of necessarily are going to be because I'm a year further on since the last time I faced that wave, but I can
Yes.
kind of see it coming. Other times, right, we're curled up on the floor of the bathroom of the kitchen because we have to take out the garbage because our person can't do it, right?
Exactly.
We
Yeah.
don't see those
Yeah.
waves coming, but we at least know that we're still in our boat. And so the wave will come, it will overwhelm the boat, but we're not going to sink anymore,
Right.
right?
Right. I
And
love this. You
then,
need to create this visual. This is so beautiful. I love
right, I
this.
need an artist because I'm so not artistic, right?
You do. I
And
mean,
then it
really, this
is,
is so poignant.
yeah, and then it is about like the waves just get further and further apart. So there are still waves that come, right? I had it happen recently. I was on a trip to Oregon for a conference, and we were staying very near one of the beautiful falls on the gorge,
Hmm.
Multnomah. I don't know if I'm saying it right. I'm probably not. Someone's going to correct me, but that's how I say it because it's very complicated spelling.
Yeah.
And so I knew, and I had said to my friend that was going to be at the conference, if we don't go see these falls as part of our, adventures on our way home, we have to go see them because they're beautiful. I love them. Like, we need to stop. So I knew the falls were going to be there. I knew
Hmm.
I was going to see them.
Hmm.
When the day came and the time came to get out of the tour bus to go and see the falls, I burst into tears
Hmm.
because the last time I was there,
Yeah.
Ben was there.
Right.
And the kids were
Right.
little. They were like 7 and 10 or however old they were, about that, maybe 8 and 11. And we walked to the top of the falls.
Oh my God.
So even though I knew I was going to,
Mhm.
and I'd known for months we were going to be in this area, I knew I was going to go see the falls. Like, I still couldn't predict that
Of
that was going to
course.
be what I now call a Ben moment. And it's
Of
just a
course.
Ben moment.
Yeah.
And I like having Ben moments. I don't like
Sure.
that he's not here, obviously. And I would give all of this growth and knowledge and experience, I would give it all up in a heartbeat to have him back. But
Of
that's
course.
not reality.
Right.
The reality is this thing has happened, and now I get to make choices all day, every day about what to do. So, yeah, I had a good cry walking up to the falls. We didn't have time to walk to the top, but we walked a little bit of the ways up to the bridge, and I had a good cry. And my lovely friend who was there was like, "Oh, what's happening?" And I said, "Oh, last time I was here was with Ben." And so she's like, "Oh my gosh, tell me about that." So I told her all about that whole visit.
Hmm.
So I'm still in the boat. It still has a
Yeah.
steering wheel. I'm still mostly driving it and choosing my direction. And sometimes the wave comes. And that's okay. And that's integration, right? That's going to happen, I suspect, for the rest of my life. And I'm okay with that.
But like you said, there's beautiful moments though. It's how you
Yeah.
choose to have the Ben moments. You can cry and be joyous and honor the time you had together and have fond memories of the time at the waterfall when he was little and his sister were little versus literally falling into the dirt and being paralyzed with
Yeah.
anxiety and fight or flight. Like you can there's beautiful cries, I would imagine, along with this, as you
Yeah.
celebrate his memory and the moments you have together. I want to like leave. This is about so much individual grief, but so much of the work that you do is also on grief at work. And grief,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned earlier, we had a brief reference to like the collective grief that we've all experienced over the past 3.5 years, which is now like insane. I was talking to my brother yesterday and we were saying like, oh, like when the pandemic happened, we keep thinking it was like a year ago. And it's like,
Right?
no, here we are 3.5 years later. Our sense of time is completely warped. Like in my mind, it's perpetually March. I still have to remind myself what month it is. And sometimes it takes a solid 4 or 5 seconds. And I'm not exaggerating because
Yep.
that grief of that moment in my life is still foggy. But when you think about like collective grief, as we've experienced, not just in the US, but as a global society, what happens? And when it's unresolved, what do you see start to happen? Because we've chatted about this briefly too.
Yeah. Like, I think what you see start to happen is what we're seeing happen, right?
Hmm.
We absolutely have had this collective experience of grief. We've lost, millions of people. And
Hmm.
besides the millions of people that we're mourning are, losses from, as we kind of joke about like being mad about having lost a vacation, but it's that kind of
Hmm.
losses. People lost jobs, people lost opportunities, people lost businesses, people lost homes.
Hmm.
And then there's like this existential sense of loss where we lost our sense of how the world works.
Yeah.
Because we also have seen in that 3.5 years a whole lot of disruption around, societal norms, many of which needed disruption as far as I'm concerned, right? We
Mhm.
needed to look at the world a different way. We've seen the environment, there's a lot of environmental grief happening right now as we're watching
Yes.
wildfires and landslides and heat waves and like catastrophic things are happening in the environment, which
Yeah.
impact us as a collective. And we're not talking about the grief piece of that. It's
Hmm.
been so interesting for me to watch what's been happening in the aftermath of the terrible fires in Maui. And many
Yeah.
of us
Oh my
feel
God.
a connection to Hawaii as this kind of idyllic place we visited. Mostly holds beautiful, fond memories. People have been married there. Like, it's been this kind of oasis of
Mhm.
beauty for lots of us for a long time. And we had these devastating, catastrophic wildfires, huge loss of life at this point. We don't know what the final figure will be. I think the last I heard it was just about 100, and it will be more
Yeah.
than that. There's no
Yeah.
question.
Without a doubt.
And what I find fascinating is how much we're all talking about that banyan tree.
Yeah. I know. Right? Yes. Okay. All right. Talk more about this. Yes.
And I think we're talking about the banyan tree, not because we don't care about the banyan tree. I am passionate about banyan trees. I love them so much. It's like irrational because I live somewhere that does not have them, but I just think they're
Yeah.
magical.
Yes.
And I think we can talk about the tree, but I
So
don't know that as a collective we're capable of talking about the people.
that's so okay. Just for people who are not familiar with the banyan tree, in Lahaina on the island of Maui, where these horrible wildfires were essentially the town of Lahaina, which is one of the oldest towns in Hawaii. It was where the Hawaii Constitution was signed. The graveyards in Lahaina, have some of Hawaii's most elite royalty from a long, long, long time
Yeah.
ago. There's a banyan tree, and it was planted in 1873, and it's so large. It has multiple trunks. It spans almost a city block. It's this magical, mystical, incredible thing. And so many people not just take pictures there. There's like spiritual ceremonies there. It just is such a
Hmm.
representative spiritual monument on Maui. And I couldn't agree more that we are able to like project our feelings of grief onto the tree. Oh my God, did you hear the tree's still alive? The amount of people that I have heard, honestly, every person who's brought up Mammoth, oh my God, the tree's gone, the tree's gone. And then, no, wait, I think the tree survived. Oh my God, the tree survived. Did you hear it? It's charred, but it's doing okay. And it must protect itself in some way. But we can't talk about the people and the families and the real lives that were lost. This is so fascinating. So, what's your perspective on this? This is incredible.
I mean, I think it's us sort of protecting ourselves in a way. I think we feel like we need to distance ourselves from other people's losses. This is part of what happens. We were talking about the change of the address book. That's it on the micro. This is it on
Yes.
the macro, right? On the macro
Yes.
level. Like, we're so scared of acknowledging grief, embracing grief, talking about
Right.
it, experiencing it with each other. And so I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
We can't even comprehend losses on that level of human life in that small of a community because it's a
Right.
relatively small community of people who live there year round. Millions of us descend and leave, but of the people who
Yes.
live there year round, it's a very small community. So the loss of life statistically is really high.
Yeah.
I think we're not comfortable enough with grief and with our own, insecurity really in the
Yeah.
world that we can go there. But what we can talk about is this magical tree.
Hmm. It's
So
so
we're kind of channeling the conversations we should really be having about, oh my gosh, can you imagine? Like, I can imagine what those families are going through. Can you
yes. Yes.
imagine being asked by authorities, if you're still missing people, to come and offer a DNA sample to
Right.
help them try and find your loved one?
Because it's just pure and unadulterated hell for anyone to
Yeah.
imagine because they can't imagine it. It's too far.
Yeah.
It's a bridge too far. Yes.
So we won't let ourselves imagine that,
Yeah.
but we're part of this collective experience because we're all so, I mean, if COVID taught us anything, it's how
Mm.
interconnected we are globally.
Yes. Oh God, absolutely. How small the
Right?
world really is.
So
Yes.
the world is now the size of a marble, and we can feel the people on the other side now. We can
Yes.
relate to their experiences,
Yes.
and we're a little bit emotionally stunted in our ability to have that be okay and
Hmm.
have that be something we could openly talk about. and even allow ourselves to imagine. It was so interesting. I've had so many countless people say to me, "Oh, I can't even imagine what you're going through."
Right, right. Oh yeah,
And I
same.
remember hearing someone, and I don't remember who it was, or I'm always try to, give accreditation to people, but I don't remember who it was. But they said that the people who say to you, "I can't imagine," are
Mhm.
actually the people who can, but can't let themselves.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
And I thought that was so powerful. And it really helped me, have a mindset shift around, like, what do you mean you can't imagine? I'm literally standing right in front of you. I am unimaginable. I don't even understand. Like, I'm so insulted by this whole thing. You can get in a whole conversation with yourself about that comment. But once I heard that, it was like, oh, okay. No, you can imagine, but you can't let yourself, and you're in protective mode. And that's okay. You get to
You
protect
don't
yourself
want to.
from
You don't
this
want to imagine.
horrifying
Yes.
experience. And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what we're seeing. And so when we talk about what we saw ripple across the world
Mhm.
in the last 3.5 years, we're a little bit in protective mode about even being able to acknowledge the level of loss of all kinds that
Yeah.
we've experienced. But it would be really healthy for us to start, because
Yes.
what happens with unexpressed emotions is a couple of things. We stuff them down in our bodies and they actually turn malignant, right? There's
Yes.
science that supports this. This is no longer, 20 years ago, this was a very woo woo idea. It's
Mhm.
now scientifically proven, right? There are all kinds of malignancies that happen in our body and dis-ease that happens in our body that's linked to trauma and emotion
Mhm.
and it not being appropriately dealt with. The other thing that happens is all of those stuffed emotions. And I remember saying this to my daughter because she grieved much more privately than I have. I mean, I'm on a podcast talking about my grief. She's chosen to do it much more privately.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
remember saying to her, it's okay to put it in a box and
Mhm.
to not be in it all the time. And you have to take really good care of that box. You
Yeah.
can't just ignore it,
Yeah.
because that box full of emotions that are hard, left
Mhm.
abandoned in your attic somewhere, will
Yes.
someday explode.
Yes, it will.
Because that's what
Yeah.
happens with unexpressed emotion. They eventually get too big and they need to explode.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing happening around us in all of the, you know, lashing out at people who are different than us, lashing
Mhm.
out at situations and circumstances beyond our control. It's a whole lot of fear and unexpressed emotion.
Mhm. So what do we do about it? What does leadership do about it? Like what I know you work on a much smaller scale with individual organizations. It's not the government. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, maybe you work with the government. I don't know. But it feels almost overwhelming to start like, but I know we do have to start small somewhere. I
Yeah.
remember at my last job, I was managing a really large team and I had like 8 or 9 direct reports and we would have these month or weekly meetings of just kind of, we called it like our brand leadership team. And I remember when the George Floyd incident happened and how she was African American. It was obviously beyond devastating to everyone, particularly to her.
Yeah.
And she just didn't know what to do. And then it was like the riots started, and people don't like to call them riots, but they were, at least in LA. And the National Guard is here, and she lived in Santa Monica. And it was just like, which is where the National Guard was. And it was just insane. And I remember I was like, one day we're going to dedicate our entire hour of our brand leadership team. And I checked with her beforehand because we were very, very close as a group and it was all
Mm-hmm.
women, to talking about this and giving her the floor to speak about whatever she wanted to talk about, her emotions. There was no right or wrong way. And she would educate us. We would listen and we would all formulate a way to help and a plan. And we actually took that model that we started with just our small team and we ended up doing it across our entire office in Los Angeles. And then that model was taken and started doing across the entire United States. So like that was one small step. But what do you say to people about how do you get started to undo some of this or just change it?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Like, what if we did that? What if right now, where we're all talking about Maui, people
Mm-hmm.
sat down at their leadership meetings or had a staff meeting and said, I know we're all feeling a whole lot of emotions about this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's bringing up a whole bunch of related stuff. Maybe that's where you got married. Maybe that's where you've always gone on vacation. Maybe that's where you had your last vacation with a loved one. Who knows? Like, we all have these ties to Hawaii.
Yes.
Let's talk about what that means to us.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Who has something that's really feeling heavy that they want to share. So we need
Mm-hmm.
to create safe spaces. That's our starting point. And I start
Yeah.
when I'm working with an organization. I start with the leadership, because this is one of those things that has to trickle down. It can't,
Absolutely.
the staff can't push it upwards. It's not going to work, because there's no safe space if the leadership hasn't modeled the safety. And
Absolutely.
again,
Yes.
this is a journey of a million baby steps. So no, we can't unpack it all in a day. You could take everyone to a smash room. I think that would be a brilliant idea, right?
God, I've
Let's all
always
go
wanted
throw
to.
plates, right?
Yeah,
Or go smash TVs or something, right? You
on
could
my
have a
bucket
scream
list.
corner in your office. I don't know. But if you give people permission and a place where they could just go and like
Yeah.
let loose, I
Yeah.
think that would help us all personally.
Forget the liability. Just go smash your computer.
Right? Exactly. Okay, maybe not in your cubicle. This might not be good. It's not what
Yeah.
we're recommending.
Oh my
One
God.
of the ways we can do it, though, is we can start to talk about losses other than the loss of a loved one, right? Which is what you did so brilliantly with the George Floyd murder and all of the things that came out of it. And so much emotion that was happening. That was really big. We saw it.
Yeah.
I mean, there was protests and
Oh,
marches here. They didn't turn into riots here because we didn't have that same level of connection. And we didn't have, I mean, there's all kinds of places where people went in and started riots and linked it to that. And it just was all
of
such a
course.
hot mess.
And it was very layered.
But
Yes,
this,
exactly.
yeah, but this was all like protests that happened globally. There were some big emotions that came up when that
Yes.
happened.
Yes, of course.
So if you could have a moment where you can say, this big thing happened globally, and let's talk about how that's maybe impacting us at work.
Love it.
And let's have
Yeah.
an awkward conversation. What if you
Yes.
did it when, we're so good at in businesses when something doesn't go the way we want. So what if you had a product and you launched it and it didn't take off the way that you wanted? We've all had that happen, right? We put our heart and soul into something, we launch it and it goes poof, and we go, oh, shoot, like what? And so we're very good at staying in our push energy, right? We want to fix it. We want to analyze it. We want to look at it. We want to pull it apart. We want to pivot. We want to use the pieces we can. We want to do it again. We're really great at that part. What if the beginning of that debrief meeting was the leader saying something like, I'm feeling a whole lot of emotions about this. We really thought we were onto something, and we worked our butts off. And crickets. Nothing happened when we launched. Nobody cared but us. And I'm feeling mad and I'm frustrated and I'm sad about it. And I'm seeing this whole income stream that we thought was coming into our business hasn't materialized. And that had a whole bunch of things attached to it that we were going to be able to do next. Now, none of that is happening. Can we just take a minute to share, one feeling word about how we're feeling? And you can pass if you don't want to. I feel frustrated. How about you, Joe? How about you, Mary? How about you, Sally? And then go into your debrief meeting, right?
Absolutely.
It's those baby steps we can take to start to acknowledge that emotions are real, that actually having them at work in a healthy way is okay, because they're at work whether you want them there or not, right? And we don't want them there, everybody in a hot mess, right? We want to be showing, like, how do we self-regulate our way through emotions? How do we feel them? Pause before we react, right? How do we build that pause space into our conversations? How do we build in, self-regulation? How do we go, ooh, my emotions just got too big for this conversation. And so before I say or do something unhealthy, I'm going to pause this meeting for 2 minutes and I'll be back.
Yes. Yes.
What if we did that instead of yelling at our team? That would be so much more healthy for all of us, right? So it's building those kinds of skills.
Yes. The psychological safety too, and the trust and respect that someone would garner by not lashing out. Because then next thing you know, everyone's talking behind their back about like, oh my God, XYZ is just an a-hole. It's like, well, no,
and we're all looking for another job.
Exactly right. Because people don't leave companies, they leave their managers. And it's like, let's be compassionate towards one another, be vulnerable, which is obviously the whole entire point of this podcast and all of the work that you do to start to change those things and actually give people that platform and that safe space to talk and to lead. Right? Like it benefits everybody. This has been like the best conversation ever. I have one more question for you, and I ask it every time. So the show's called What Nobody Tells Us. So when you think about grief and what nobody tells us about grief, and from your experience, your collective work, what are some of the things that nobody talks about?
I mean, this is a whole nother hour podcast. So I'm going to give
I
you
know.
I'm going to give you a PowerPoint form. Nobody talks about the physical symptoms. Yeah. Nobody talks about the physical symptoms.
Mhm.
Nobody talks about the psychological impact. Nobody talks about the layered losses and the secondary losses. Nobody talks about how long it's really going to take.
Mhm.
Nobody talks about what you could say to someone that wouldn't be harmful.
Mhm.
Nobody talks about grief.
Yeah. And we need to. We need
We need
to.
to.
I think I'm so happy that you're doing the work that you're doing. And I'm so happy that you came on to talk about this because I think it's going to help a lot of people. So thank you so much. And if people wanted to reach out, where could they find you? If they want to learn more, if they want to work with you, what's the best place?
Yeah, the best place is on my website, which is alivedexperience.com. And if you
Mhm.
start at alivedexperience.com/book, you'll actually link right to the ebook about how to support people in the workplace, which is a great starting point. Just it's very short, just a few ideas and suggestions to get you started. And then, yeah, surf around. All the links to the socials are there. You can find blog posts and free resources. It's all there.
It is amazing. Suzanne, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I see you. I hear you. Your grief journey is real. And I hope that your friends and family that are listening feel like they can talk to you about it because we all need to talk about it.
What a beautiful gift, honestly, to have learned all of this stuff. Yes, thank you.
You're so welcome.
Well, that's it. Another episode of What Nobody Tells Us. I hope you learned something. I hope you felt something. And I hope you feel empowered to go start a conversation with somebody who you know might be going through something that you don't understand. Lean in. Don't peace out. Thanks so much for spending some of your day with me today. I really, really love that you did that. If you want to reach out, if you got an idea for an episode, you just want to give me some feedback or just say, hey, do so at Nobody Tells Us on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, or X, whatever we're calling it these days. No one knows. Reach out, Christy at nobodytellsus.com. Shoot me an email there or visit my website, www.nobodytellsus.com. Until next time, see you later.